So welcome to this discussion. Again, thank you for participating. Let's start with some initial thoughts on the call, and then we will go to actually discussing what people said. So let's start from Namita. What do you think? Who are you leaning?
Opening government for now.
Okay. Let's say Michael.
I have also gone in a close margin to opening government.
Okay. And yeah, Umar?
Yeah, so also, well, pretty contentious. I'm leaning towards opening government as well.
Okay. Let's talk about stuff that happened in the debate. So can some of you volunteer to sum up what do we get as like main points of contribution from opening government first?
Yeah, can I start?
Yeah, you can do it.
Yeah, I think opening government firstly characterizes what democracies largely look like right now. The direction they're heading in terms of like leaders probably sacrificing certain democratic rights or certain rights that are supposed to be in democracy is not being followed at this point. Secondly, they point out issues with democracy in terms of leaders not being able to implement policies or implement things that are going to make the country better. Lastly, they talk, and then they move on to talk about why this policy implementation is necessary, which is to say when people demand certain actions or when people demand certain things of a government, it's not necessary that they want a democracy, but they want a better life. And therefore, through this, I think they identify their goal largely that citizens within the state should have a better life for themselves. This can be produced in a technocracy because a technocracy is chosen because of people from qualifications. These people then have qualifications these people are qualified enough that they're going to be able to implement policies. And I think then throughout the two speeches, they focus on how policy implementation and identification is important and not simply the formulation of a policy. And I think this is where they differentiate between like technocracies and democracies in terms of how policies then pan out. And then like other harms instead of like why politicians are bad and incentive structures that exist under each model.
Okay. Does any of you want to add something before I sum up some of the things that I think are also in?
Yeah, so I think if I can just chime in a little bit, I agree largely with what Namita is saying. I think also what I like from the opening government is I think they paint a really fair characterization under which we see typical people within the or the governmental structure of democracy, and contrasting that nicely with the ideas or incentives. And I think largely it falls into these two smaller clashes on utility and consent. And I think there is definitely a larger value to the one of utility.
Okay, cool. So we have like, as I understood it, like if we want to pack it into something like, and that's very important when we're trying to compare stuff, to pack it into some sort of clash-like format. So we have first argument that is basically based on a knowledge that like better knowledge equals better policy, which is proven on 3 levels. As we said, like taking issues seriously, understanding complex consequences, the means of selecting politicians is bad in itself. And we have added additions afterwards that we're going to talk about from both oppositions, adding to it, and DPM answering some of that point. We have second point about representation, and that's like very important because it clashes to some extent with this principal point that is coming, which means that elections are not really representative and not really representing everybody. That's second. And we have 2 smaller points that come in the Deputy Prime Minister, which is about tyranny and corruption, which says that tyranny is less likely to happen under democracy, under technocracy, and the corruption is less likely to happen. Although these 2 points are less proven than the first two points because they are spent less time on it. Okay, so do we agree this is like this is the thing that we are now comparing? Okay. Can either of you, Michael or Umar, sum up opening opposition?
Yeah, I'll do this one. Yeah, I'll do this one. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. Opening opposition, I think, take an interesting path in this. The first thing they claim is that in general, you want people to have agency, and that importantly, people having agency means they can hold the state accountable and that they can therefore control their own destiny. I think the most interesting thing comes at Tin, where I think he argues pretty early on in his speech. I put this in capital letters because I thought it was really interesting, which is that regardless of whether that one person is good or not, it's principally unjust to invest all your fate on that one person just in the possibility that they are potentially a good person and by sheer luck that they'll make a good decision. And I think that is the very large thrust of what the beginning of opening opposition have to say. I think more overall, they just make the general point that it's good to have more representation. And I think a lot of their case, and I think maybe this is why I would more leaning towards opening government at this point, is kind of based on a couple of kind of model bashing or rebuttals that go against opening government. So they say things like, Trump and Bolsonaro is actually a point, to have more democracy rather than less, which I think a lot of their case is kind of centered on. And I think basically overall, and DLO adds in, I think, a bunch of like little things of their own, things like, consent is more important than anything else, which I think are really interesting ideas. But often I don't think there is a lot of justification from them. Like I really stuff about how, utility is only valuable if you get to be the one who that chooses it. But I think doesn't take a POI at all at this point, which I really wanted them to take, because obviously OG should be given a chance to respond. But I think also just isn't particularly well explained. But I guess their general thrust is just, more people holding the government accountable equals good. Don't put all your in the hands of a couple of people, is basically my summary of the OO case.
Okay. Does anybody want to add something to that, or should I just sum up like I did for opening government, just quickly?
I do think like certain lesser ideas that they try to clash with opening government on are probably things of how, probably like the practicalities of how OG's case is probably going to pan out in terms of questioning them on their incentivization of technocracies, and then also trying to prove why utility is trying to prove why utility is probably not as valuable as consent. But then again, I agree with Michael where they aren't able to prove where consent trumps utility, particularly because I think like OG already shows how everyone has not consented into the same
Okay, so similar things that I got, but let's sum it up. I got like this principle of recourse to the state, which said which is coming in this case, which means that basically state has power over you and it determines your happiness, so you should have some recourse towards it. And second point is less explained but still there, like you're forcing people to destroy property and do the revolution if they want to turn you over. And also we have the way. That's basically their case. Other stuff is a rebuttal, which is still fine, which we're gonna evaluate now, but that's their main positive contributions, right? Okay. Okay, so now that we established what was said, the next thing to do is to try and establish, how do we now compare these two things, right? So we need to first evaluate how much is something proven, right? To what extent I am buying, because like obviously, if you look at it, every team damages each other's points to some extent, right? Darian answers some of the utilitarian points coming from opening government. Tin also does it. And also Deputy Prime Minister damages some of the principal points. So we need to, first of all, assess how much is it proven and how much is it proven after this damage has been done to the point. So let's start from the first point that we started to talk about. Like we talked about like this knowledge point, and I mentioned that they had 3 points like that Lucia brings, which is like taking issues seriously, understanding complex issues, means of selecting politicians is bad. What do you think these 3 things, what is the claim that they now proven with this analysis?
The ability of people to make better choices are better in a technocracy, because they have the people who have the capacity to make these decisions.
Yes, so they are more knowledgeable. Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I get. Like they're more knowledgeable. Okay. So what are the responses? What responses are you trying having to pick from LO or DLO to that point? And let's see how can we evaluate them. Are they good enough? What are they doing? Either of you can Umar, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think we definitely get the response from the opposition side that regardless of whether or not they have that knowledge, the ability of them to actually act in the interest of the individuals that the people have deemed to be important in today's debate is something that has yet to been proven by the government side.
Okay. Yeah. They're so that's coming from deputy leader of the opposition, if I'm not mistaken, right? When he's talking about that they have not proven who is the one who is going to be setting these KPIs, this internal apparatus of wealthy, educated people who will necessarily pander to these people as well. And the last thing is to say, like, you feel superior to everybody, like you habituate in this system. So this means that you don't listen to these people. So that are responses towards some of these things. So how do we evaluate this? How do you think how much is this harmful towards opening government? This first point doesn't mean that they lose, but how would you think of this response?
I do think that incentive structure was already sort of implicitly alluded to in Lucia's speech, in terms of when she draws a comparative between politicians only having short-term or politicians only having the incentive to stay in office and nothing beyond that, whereas people who are chosen because of meritocracy need to maintain their merit status and therefore are necessarily going to do things that have positive impact. I think that definitely weighs over simple questioning as to why they have an incentive.
So if I was to sum up, right? Opening government is trying to prove to me that these people are knowledgeable, and because of this knowledge, they will do some good policies, right? What opening opposition is trying to attack is not this knowledge point, like they somewhat conceded, right? But they're trying to attack that this doesn't necessarily flow into the second point, right? The logic doesn't flow from you being knowledgeable necessarily going into this. And like, as I said, we can, to some extent, deputy leader of the opposition's responses are, like, we can agree, are not overpowering, not like fully taking the point down, but are muddying the point and mitigating the point, right? Let's say like this. Okay, so that's how we like evaluate to some extent rebuttal, right? Like, we are looking at what do they try to prove, what is this rebuttal trying to break? Like, they're trying to break the logical chain between step one and step two. Step one is pretty well cushioned by Lucia because she's trying to prove that these people are knowledgeable, but that's not the point that opposition is trying to attack, right? So that's the thing. Do we have some rebuttal from Tin's speech that we can tie to this particular point?
Yeah, I've got a couple of things I think Tin maybe indirectly tries to respond with. The main frame that I think Tin tries to do this whole thing in is, what if all of this knowledge is wrong? What if all of this knowledge doesn't necessarily mean better policies? And I think he says, for example, that just because you have knowledge does not mean that you have claim to the correct policy, which he points out with the EU example of technocrats running a union, but making some really, really bad decisions. I think the problem with that argument, and why I don't think it overrides the stuff that comes from opening government, is because much as they can claim that there are errors that occur under technocracy, I think Lucia and Connor are able to prove that on a balance of probabilities, there are more structural reasons for technocracies to go wrong compared to where democracies go wrong. So although Ting does an okay job of saying technocracies don't always get it right, that does not seem to be in the burden of what opening government have to prove, which is why I don't think it's as effective in taking down OG's general point here.
So what is Tim trying to attack with this? Let's try to identify this. Let's say unpack this. So Tim, out of these two things, like with these technocrats are not perfect with these examples, he's probably trying to attack the first point, right? That knowledge is not there, right? Or the knowledge is not perfect, right? Which is at best mitigation, right? As we said, like at best it can mitigate that they're not perfect, but how comparative is that in comparison to who is more likely to be, better equipped to, make decisions? He doesn't provide, right? This point requires at least the comparative of why politicians are less often wrong or something for that point to be very meaningful and standing, right? That's how I would interpret it, if you agree. We have one more response that I want you to evaluate, which is, Lucia already alludes to it from the beginning. It doesn't, in my opinion, give a good preemption to, which is that politicians do have advisors. that are going to give them some knowledge. How do you think this interacts? How do you think this, does this damage, like, I mean, it obviously damages to some extent, but to what extent do we think it's damaging towards opening government?
So if I can just, I think they do a significant enough critique of how politicians actually engage with like decision making and the advisory, like the advisors in what we assume a democracy to be. And I think that's quite a good strategic move, because by critiquing it and then contrasting it with what all the benefits they provide of a technocracy, it gives us that way up, that comparative that I think is pretty valuable.
Can you give me the specific, like I know exactly what you're talking about, but it's very important to be specific in these kind of situations. I think it comes from Connor, in Deputy Prime Minister. Can you tell me where does he respond to that point? Because I do think Connor has a good response to that.
Yeah, I think he Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go, Umar.
Oh yeah, so I think he responds when he talks about the ability of the individuals. Actually, I'm not exactly sure which part you're talking about. So I'm not sure which direct response you're asking me to.
So at the beginning, so when Tin is talking about like we having advisors and you can do all of these things with it, it is powerful in comparison to Lucia, because Lucia doesn't really defend herself that well from you having advisors, which is obviously to some extent true. Obviously, Tin doesn't explain to the fullest extent what does that mean, what does that do in the debate, but still it does damage to some extent, can we say, government. But what Connor does and what Connor brings, right, is saying that it's not about knowing stuff. And to some extent that mitigates also Lucia's material first, but it's also that politicians, even though they're hearing from these advisors, still have to appeal to the lowest common denominator. So Connor continues in this way of incentives of politicians, right? So Lucia's speech is mostly focusing on this knowledge, which is heavily mitigated by this first point. And Connor's speech does add, can I say, substance in terms of incentive point, right? So that's what I'm trying to interact with each other. Because as I said, like at the beginning, I think Tin does manage, like even though his response is not full and not complete, does manage to some extent damage that point. Okay. Okay.
I think there's one more layer of response that Connor also brings. Mostly when he talks about how at the end politicians are the ones that have to implement the advisory statements given, which is to say that at the end the interpretation of a policy is going to happen by the politician and not by the person who has the merit. Which is to say, even if the person with qualification is helping the politicians, at the end it's the politicians making decisions, and that can go wrong, and that's why it's bad.
Okay, cool. So after we unpacked all of the responses towards this point, to what extent are we convinced? So obviously it's interactive. It's not like 100 or 0. We believe 100, we believe 0%. It's dynamic, right? To what extent do we believe this better policy point? What is left standing after all of this rebuttal? Go.
Do you want me to give this one a go?
Yeah, go. Right.
I'm going to go with, so the way that I saw this issue pan out is both sides point out that there are possibilities that exist that either democracy or technocracy have the potential to go wrong because of individual faults that might occur within those systems, or the fact that knowledge or elections don't necessarily either way lead to better policy. However, opening government are able to prove that on a balance of probabilities, because of the multiple structural faults that they prove with elections and the short-termism, else the lowest common denominator nature of politics as it occurs in democracies, the likelihood that that will go wrong is considerably higher than the what if of technocracies going wrong, which could go wrong. And there are examples to suggest that that could happen, but you can't win that issue just off of what if. And I think OG do enough work to say the likelihood is better on their side.
So just to add one thing before we continue to another point. Their responses are fine in mitigating and like lowering my opinion of technocrats, but it's in no mean increasing my belief that the democratic system will do it better, right? So to some extent, it does balance the playing field. It's not useless. It's not like it's something that we should count. But I'm still, after this point, convinced that technocrats, even though they have flaws, are better suited and better going to make these policy decisions than a democratic system. So this is like the comparative, in the comparative analysis from the opening opposition is missing in that sort of situation, right? So that's the reach of their rebuttal, and this is something that is valuable to study. Okay, that's the first point given. That's maybe one of the most important points from opening government. So we already see that they're winning this clash, and we think because of this comparative point, probably that they're winning it by a decent margin, right? That this clash is theirs. Let's then talk about other points from opening government and see how it interacts with other things. Representation. So we have a point from, can some of you sum up what Lucia says about representation? What is not just Lucia, but what opening government has problems with in representation?
So there are two things with respect to representation. One, in terms of elections, which is to say because of voter suppression or because of people not voting, the entire demographic of the country is not represented. And secondly, you have some sort of a biased representation where you have a dissonance between the views of the people that you want to target and the views of the people that end up getting elected. So there's therefore a difference. One, there's a vacuum. Secondly, there's some sort of dissonance / difference that exists.
Does anybody want to add something to that before we start going into responses and clashing that?
Okay. One more thing I will add is to say that the representation is particularly bad for minorities in the sense that majoritarianism is what is focused by the democratic method of representation through elections. And that means that minorities often are victims of things like environmental damage because the majority just don't care about how they feel. That's the only thing that I would add.
Okay. So even before we go into the actual responses, because one of them is this, do you see some flaws with this part of the argumentation that they're presenting? What is missing? What can we say is missing from that representation point? Like, I have one particular thing in mind.
Why is technocracy better?
Yes, exactly, right? So that's the point. Like they are similar to what responses to first point from Op does. Similarly, they are bashing on democracy, but I am unsure and unclear why, and that can happen. Like that is a completely valid argument. Like I've run this when I've done this debate, but I'm not seeing analysis on why technocrats would pay attention to liberals, conservatives, both, why they would pay attention to minorities as well to some extent. This is still useful, but it is a weaker point because it doesn't receive this comparative from the other side, right? Okay, let's then hear what are the actual responses from opposition. Can somebody sum up? Like whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think there's one or two that come from the leader of opposition when he talks about the democratic checks through the forms of things like opposition to create grassroots movements that actually promote change and allow for challenges on the majoritarian views in democracy, and that sort of speaks to like this ability to actually achieve some form of representation. That's something I got from the leader of opposition.
Okay. So I've got one more thing from leader of the opposition, which is this, like, even if you have 1 to 3 seats, you can be kingmaker in the parliament. People can make coalitions with you in the search situation. So we have 2 responses from leader of the opposition. Let's evaluate them. Let's evaluate how much do you think this is damaging? How much do you think, what does it do in the beginning? Does anybody want to try and evaluate what does it do to the analysis of opening government?
Yeah, with the second one, especially when they say that, hey, we can provide representation if you give like 2 or 3 votes to minorities. I'm quite unsure how that's going to pan out, since it still seems to me that there's a very clear power dynamic. I'm unclear as to how minorities are ever going to be able to quote unquote trade policies in their favor and how that's actually going to come out later on. So I don't really value it as much of a response. It doesn't do much damage in my opinion.
Yes. So there, it is to some extent, as I said, like a valid response, but it's not don't spend enough time to me to explain how does this look like, why is this the majority of situations actually, like it's similar what you can say to Harish say like US centric, the US centric that they impose from opening government. I'm not sure where does this apply. Like it might apply in Europe where you have mandatory seats or somewhere, but I'm not sure what is the grasp of this response. And the other thing about grassroots movement, what do you think is the how do we evaluate that?
I just think it's quite example centered. Like what I have in terms of analysis is AOC and Bernie Sanders. And I'm like, okay, one country, no structural reasons why that is repeatable in other countries. They then say trade deals between governments, another example, again, unsure why structural reasons exist for that to always happen. So I just think, look, under each such doesn't seem.
Analysis is not there, right? So this just says that some movements were sufficient. It doesn't say why everybody gets representation and why the representation is actually okay or good. Especially with how they say Connor then answering and Lucia counter answering and saying, but they didn't get elected. They're not in power. They're not deciding policies to some extent. So to some extent, like that is not a sufficient response. What are we getting from deputy leader of the opposition towards this?
There's still more ability to consent. So the debate is comparative. Like you still have more ability to represent people in a world where you have elections. So even if it's not fully, it's still comparatively more. I think that's the response that I hear from DLO.
Not every country is the US, right?
No, I also get like one more thing where they try to compare. I don't think they do it fully, but I think they try to compare in pointing out the flaws in technocracy when they say that technocrats are going to necessarily pander to rich people, which means now they have absolutely no incentive to pander to low people. Whereas on the other hand, in a democracy, people either can go out and vote for minority representation or they can choose not to vote, but that also depends on their consent. Again, I don't think it's a very valuable or damaging response, but I do think it's a response.
So what he says, and this is a very true thing when we're comparing principle and practical. Usually people are very like exclusive when they're talking about this, right? And they're talking about like, either you have 100% consent or you 0% consent, or you lose. Like, right? Obviously, they are trying to prove to us that you have more consent and this is valuable. It's still to us, it's still to the other side to try to mitigate it, but it's not a value that the principle completely doesn't stand because you don't have 100% representation. So in that sense, I think DLO is correct. It doesn't seem they win. It just seems that this is sometimes a very like common mistake when people are judging principle versus practical, which is to say, but it's not 100%, so definitely they lose. Definitely they haven't proven their burden. This is not necessarily what Darian is saying. This is not their burden to prove. It's just that to some extent you have more comparative, more comparative representation. Okay. Okay, so now we evaluated this. We evaluated that, like if we sum up what you said, we are not really convinced that much by their representation responses. We are convinced that obviously still some of the points from opening opposition have validity, but it's not that they really properly answered this reasoning that is coming from both Lucia and okay. So where do you think, what is the point, what is this representation point clashing with from the opposite? And we can then this in clash. What is it doing? Where does it play out when we start to compare two cases?
Where they talk about...
sorry. One of you go. Who wants? Michael, go. Come on.
All right, I was gonna say like the disproportionate power that governments have. I think that's the main thing that it clashes against. So
yes, so to some extent,
government's huge power. Therefore, you have to be able to.
Okay. Sorry. You cut off, so I thought you were done. Sorry. So if you want, you can finish what you wanted to say.
No, I have huge amounts of lag. It's fine. I was just gonna say disproportionate power government.
Okay. Yeah. So it clashes directly, and you can make a principle clash that is happening. This is tying into this principle clash pretty nicely because it's trying to mitigate the extent that this principle actually manifests itself and how much do you actually have the power of the government. Because like what opening, and we're gonna come to that clash in a second. Just before we go, let's evaluate two last things because I think they're minor. They don't receive that many responses, but they're also not that well analyzed. So what do we get on tyranny and corruption, just briefly, from DPM? Either of you.
On tyranny, I get the idea that you're probably going to have less manipulation of power and less staying in power simply because this recruitment system or the selection system of these technocrats is going to be transparent in the sense that you can see their qualifications and you can see their record of achievement, and you're less likely to therefore bribe someone to get you and stay in that position of power. But I think that's the extent of what I get. It's not very well analyzed.
Okay. And similar with corruption, as I said, like it says fewer people to bribe, and also easier to pay them off. I'm not sure why that's true. So these 2 points are less relevant when comparing stuff than other points. Opening opposition. Let's then evaluate their case and then evaluate the responses, and then we clash them together, which is then perfectly clashing now with stuff that we already said. So principles. How do they prove their principle? What do you think is the main structure of the TIN's analysis, and what area adds?
So I think a lot of it has to do with this sort of this idea that the people are completely dependent on the state, and their ability to actually affect it is something that's intrinsically important over the utility that we get from the opening government. And that's where we get that clash on consent first, that inherent utility, that sort of principle legitimacy as to why we'd value democracy.
Yes. So they're trying to say to me that there is some right that because state has such power over you and your happiness is dependent on that state, you do need to have the ability to control this state. What do you think? Like before we go into rebuttal, where do you think the analysis is lacking? Where do you think you would want more analysis from them? Which doesn't necessarily mean that they have to do it, but what is the weaker part of this analysis?
I think I would have liked a little bit of analysis as to like the fact that people, by having this ability, actually are able to achieve that sort of ability to hold the government accountable. And that's something that became really contentious, especially when you're talking about minorities and their ability to create change in a system, because then you're defending a system where you're claiming people have this ability, but the examples that we have coming up don't really see that coming to fruition.
Yes, and that, like, we can immediately, if you want, clash it with this representation point, because that's a perfect match in terms of a clash, right? Because like opening government is to some extent explaining to us that this representation is quite weak, and a lot of people are left out of the circles of power and deciding what they want. Whilst the opening opposition is saying that you do have the right to decide for the state, but if they don't either push back sufficiently on this point about how they say why representation is not there, or explain to me why this like magic of circling a box once every 4 years or 5 years gives you this recourse. That's the issue. Like we buy, like I guess, like if we sum up, like we all buy the first premise, right? That state does have power over you. State does, like, your happiness is dependent on the state. State does owe you something in return, but we are not necessarily buying to the fullest extent. The next layer of analysis is why this is the best way that state should give it back to you, right? Which is like giving you circling the vote, and why this actually has power to actually do all of these things and recourse to the state that Teen is talking about, right?
I think one more thing I would have liked is a clearer picture on what exactly people can control, like the factors they're able to contribute in within a democracy. Because without them explaining to me what factors these people are going to be able to contribute to, or what minorities can actually influence, I'm unsure why that influence should be there or how it's going to come up, because I don't know what the influence is.
So do we have some direct responses? I mean, we do. Can you point to some direct responses towards this from Deputy Prime Minister?
I think they point to two things. Firstly, that consent is not guaranteed now. They give two mechanisms to this. First, that the voting system is bad in certain countries, which structurally excludes people, something that PM referred to anyway. But secondly, that in a system that doesn't...
Oh, sorry, you cut off.
Right, I'm going to assume you got my first point about the voting system. The second thing that they said, the second thing they said is that in a system that doesn't have direct democracy or Athenian democracy, it is unclear how that is achieved anyway, because we vote for our representatives and the representatives do a certain thing that we don't necessarily consent to anyway. So we don't achieve that level of consent right now through democracy.
Yes, exactly. So we do have some mitigation towards, so in either of these responses, he's not denying that you do have some level of consent, but he's heavily mitigating to what extent this consent actually manifests in public, right? And so we value these responses. Does DLO answer something back? Like, do we have back and forth on this, or yeah?
DLO says this is the worst case scenario of democracy. We can just change democracy to become better.
Why is that response?
And we can take away these problems.
What is problem with this sort of response from DLO? And also LO to some extent actually also says, we want more democracy. What is the problem with this logic that they're providing?
I'm quite unsure I'm quite unsure on where they're going towards with this democracy, because they say, yes, we want more democracy, but they never really point out what specific parts of democracy they want and why it's not present or cannot be present in a technocracy as well.
And how does it look like, right? Like more democracy, like if it's not, like, obviously if it's unachievable, and if opening government is proving to me, look, here is why it's unachievable, obviously not to the full extent, you still need to provide opening opposition, hey, look, here is why it is achievable. Here is the analysis of why it is achievable. Not we just want more democracy. Like, you can want a lot of stuff, but if it doesn't manifest, and if you don't prove it, we don't really count it that much. So in that scenario, we believe that principal case is on a shaking ground after this response, right? What do we think about the second principal point, which is this forcing people to the revolution?
I think there's an underlying implication of that people should care about their future. But and I think this comes out when they're trying to explain the unfairness of revolution in Tim's speech, when he says that the revolution or protests is bad because people, when they perceive no control, they're going to revolt. Revolt is bad because they're going to damage the things that they use in the future. And I think at this point, I'm quite unclear as to why protests are going to specifically happen once technocracies arise. But secondly, I'm also unclear on why people should, at this point, that they're living in, care about certain things they want in the future and how they're going to use them. So on both folds,
we have a response from DPM. Like, we have one response to DPM to this point. What is it that we pointed out just?
Do you mean to DPM or from DPM?
From DPM to this revolution point, from Riot.
I think it was something like I remember these words, but I forgot to write it down. It was something like, it doesn't matter if they have to use that kind of protest, but I'm pretty, I just remember there was a response actually, but I've forgotten what the exact words were.
The response that I've got was literally if we have better policies, people have less, people are gonna riot less, or overall, if you have good healthcare, if you live in this system, which is, it's not best. It's not the best response. Obviously, I would want more of these things. Why? But this ties it. What this response does is ties it to the clash about utility, about who gets better policies, right? In this sort of situation, which is actually quite interesting. Which we already decided that opening government to some extent, to some extent wins. So if there are overall better policies and more people are satisfied, then we can clash this revolution point by how likely it is that revolution happens, and how likely does Tin and Darian prove to us that revolution are going to happen, which I'm not sure that they do. I'm not sure that they prove to me how often or how likely it is that, they just prove to me, if something bad happens, then you have to do this. But I'm not sure why this is, why this is so bad. But also, if you want to tie it into clash, I'm purposefully trying to tie stuff into the clash in order to show you how you can compare them in this situation. Even though in some other discussion we might not. So other things that you can tie into this clash is probably this tyranny point, right? If it was better analyzed, then it would even more tip the scale towards the towards the opening government, because like if they prove to me that how they say it's much more likelier that democracies leads to tyranny, then revolution point is almost non-comparative or worse on their side of the house. So that will be stuff that goes into the same clash together, that we can put together in the same clash and we can evaluate. So if we put it in clashes, we have like one on utility, one on utility, who gets better policies passed, and we already agreed to some extent that opening government takes this, and that we're still believing that technocrats are better able to make decisions, right? That's one. So that's a clash one by opening government. We believe that principal points in representation point, to some extent, obviously, like you have a more consent on opening opposition, but we believe that it's very much, how do you say, diminished by opening governments. First of all, representation point, but second of all, responses from corner, right? If I want to sum up. And the third point about revolutions, first of all, we think that both sides of the house didn't really contribute that much towards that clash, because opening opposition doesn't make it that powerful in terms of, how do you say, how often does it happen, how damaging it is. But also, even in that sort of scenario, bring it back to better policies means less revolutions and also some sort of clash on tyranny. We believe at best it's a wash. At worst, we're not sure how relevant this is to debate, right? So that's how I would sum up our discussion so far, right? Do you have something to add to this summing up, or is this fine? So let's one last thing before we just clash these two main clashes basically that we found out is this. We have one weighing. So after I've summed this up, we as I said, first clash, one of the most important ones that we realize, who gets better policies, opening government wins it. Second clash on the principle and representation to some extent. Let's say that to some extent you have more choice on opening opposition, but it's heavily diminished. And the third clash is washy, but also not as relevant, and we are not seeing it as relevant as the other two. So now we should clash these two clashes in order to evaluate who wins, right? And who is getting ahead of itself. So let's look at the first actually what teams are saying about it. Why is the way, like opening government, does opening government try to weigh this clash up against each other? I'm not seeing it, so if somebody else is seeing it. No, right? So opening government does not try to weigh their utilitarian metric versus this. They're just trying to respond to this, which is fine, which is actually what usually happens in this sort of debate, and you still need to deal with this, right? So deputy leader of the opposition does try to weigh. Let's see how deputy leader of the opposition tries to do it. Can somebody sum it up?
Yes. Especially, I think they try to weigh it when they're trying to talk about the comparative between something that has utility and then compare it with something that's valuable. And I think they do so when they talk to me about how people choose to experience certain things and how they choose to not experience certain things, and therefore it's unfair for opening government to view something as like completely valuable just because it exists or just because it's beneficial towards people. And then secondly, I do think they talk about how when states have to justify the exercise of their power, it's done so in terms of consent, and therefore given that people have the right to choose to vote or not to vote, at least this consent exists, whereas on their side you don't have a definitive marker of what is valuable and what is not. That's what I got.
Okay. Does anybody want to add something, or how do you think this plays out in this clash? That can, like, you can go if you want, or Michael.
I like this point. I just think you were not given a single moment to respond to this, which is really annoying. I really wanted a POI, as I said before. But secondly, it is just brutally unclear to me how democracy achieves this either. Like, why is it necessarily, like, given the whole idea we had about consent not achieved under democracy, why was it true that they were achieving that? And therefore that weighing becomes a lot less relevant if the opposition bench hasn't proved that they would achieve what they're valuing anyway.
As we said, like a very good weighing, if the material, and if they manage to prove to a sufficient extent why democracy is comparatively, not just why it has some consent, because obviously we after the debate believe that there is some consent more on the opposition side, but why that consent is so relevant that we should sacrifice, because that's their burden. Like they lost the clash on utility. If they lost the clash on utility, then they need to tell me why they need to sacrifice people's lives getting worse for this some consent, which is heavily mitigated. And this weighing would be better if you had more analysis on the clash, right? So that's how I would take it. Does anybody else want to add something to it? Okay. So does anybody want to, like, I think this is pretty much almost the end of the discussion. We went through almost everything. We were very thorough. Not necessarily something that will happen in a like tournament setting because you have a more limited time. Like initially thought this was going to be shorter, but then we started to unpack things, and I think this was useful or something. So if anybody wants to sum up how did we decide opening government versus opening opposition, you can do it now, and then we can conclude this thing. If not, I can also do it.
I'm happy to give it a go if no one else is. So a couple of things. Firstly, on the subject of policy, I think both sides potentially have the potential to have bad policies as a result of their respective models of technocracy and democracy. Opening government are able to point to enough faults within the status quo to suggest that maybe the alternative of technocracy is more likely to land better policies than the alternative. If that is, and that tends to be the most important issue in this, most important issue in the debate. But even if representation is the thing that is valued, it seems that the opening government is better able to prove that representation is less likely to be harmful towards things like minorities when it is represented by technocrats, and that there are enough problems as it stands in democracy in terms of whether they represent everyone or not. That issue becomes comparatively important and is not sufficiently proven by opening opposition for me to care that representation is a huge harm under side opening government, and that even if there is a disproportionate amount of power that the state has, it's unclear how democracy necessarily changes the level of power that they have, and that consent was never something that we particularly cared about, given the current state of democracy not being a direct democracy, but being something where we vote for our representatives and give them some power anyway. So it's still up to whether it causes a utile or a good set of policies that are resorted to citizens, which we should weigh more in the debate. So that's probably why I would lean towards open government over opening opposition in a relatively close and marginal clash, for the reason that no one really proves definitive benefit.
So are you two still sticking with opening government, right?
Yep.
Yep.
Me too. So in like unanimous call, opening government wins. So just briefly before we end the recording, and I can talk to you a bit more about some things, even though we are really, let me say, this was long. Just like common mistakes that people need to pay attention to when they're adjudicating and stuff, like, and common like advice is, first of all, to try to put stuff into the clashes and try to clash stuff that doesn't necessarily at first glance seem clashable, right? Representation point with the principal point, like, fits perfectly with each other. Also, principal point about revolution, and also tyranny, and also to some extent utility, right? This makes it easier for you to make these comparisons in this situation. Also, as I said, specificity is king in these sort of definitions. Like usually, like it's very important to be able to quickly refer back to, how do you say, notes, and refer back to how exactly was this analyzed, because this is something that will make or break sometimes very close comparatives in this sort of situation. And lastly, rebuttal, to some extent, even though something has an answer to it, it still has some sort of burden that it needs to be fulfilled, right? For it to be overtaken. It's very useful to not just think in ways of, this is responded or not responded, but it's also very useful to think in ways of, what did this rebuttal actually do? Did it mitigate? Is it comparative? Like, how damaging was it? Because obviously it has some value, but it's on you to evaluate how much value it is.